Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Race, Religion, and Justice in America, a virtual symposium on how religious and racial formations continue to organize the political struggles of Blacks in their quest for more meaningful and content lives here in the U.S. in view of what can be perceived as an enduring white supremacist social order. My name is Cleve Tinsley, and I'm the director of the new Center for African American History and Culture here at Virginia Union. And today's event is the second of what are three pre-launching events that seek to showcase the kinds of topics that we feel are important for Virginia Union's engagement as it relates to public culture. The mission of Virginia Union's Center for African American History and Culture is to be an epicenter for furthering the university's goal to create a more just and humane society. We'll do so by serving as a clearinghouse for critical conversation and instruction regarding African American cultural life through cutting-edge research, education and training, arts programming and preservation, and also robust community and civic engagement. We're delighted today to have our guest scholars and community leaders who've agreed to come help us with our efforts. But for those who are not familiar with them, we think it's highly suggestible that you get to know them. And so Dr. Carmichael will now introduce our esteemed guest today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tinsley. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Virginia Union University. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Melanie Price. Dr. Price is an endowed professor of political science at Prairie View A&M University and principal investigator for their African American Studies Initiative, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. Dr. Price recently was named inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice. Dr. Price is also the author of two books. Add these to your list: The Race Whisperer, Barack Obama and the Political Uses of Race, and Dreaming Blackness, Black Nationalism and African American Public Opinion. Dr. Price is not only a professor at Prairie View, she's also an alumna, completing her BA magna cum laude in geography while there. She is a regular contributor for the New York Times opinion section and has done political commentary for CNN, Miss Magazine, Hartford Courant, Pacifica and Houston, New York City, and CT Public Radio. Won't you help me welcome Dr. Price? And we also would like to welcome to Virginia Union University's virtual space none other than Dr. Nicole R. Phillips, an associate professor in the practice of sociology of religion and culture and the director of the Black Church Studies program in the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She is also associate faculty in the Department of Sociology at Emory College of Arts and Sciences and a senior faculty fellow at the Emory Center for Ethics. Dr. Phillips' research interests lie at the intersection of religion and American public life, with a focus on community and congregational studies, where she investigates the moral commitments and the vision of community and congregational members. Her scholarship is around religion, critical race, gender, and cultural memory studies. Her most recent monograph, Patriotism, Black and White, The Color of American Exceptionalism, is a must read. It's a study of Black and white evangelicals in a rural Southern community and their shifting interpretations of American national identity and U.S. exceptionalism with the election of Barack Hussein Obama as America's first president of African descent and at the height of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Please welcome Dr. Phillips.
Thank you for having me.
Now I'd like to extend a welcome to Dr. Lerone A. Martin. He is the Director of American Cultural Studies and Associate Professor of Religion and Politics, American Cultural Studies and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. His research primarily focuses on religious and political history and the African American experience in the FBI. In support of his research, Martin has received a number of nationally recognized fellowships and grants, including the National Endowment for Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. He is the author of award-winning Preaching on Wax, the Phonograph in the Making of Modern African-American Religion, which tracks the role of the phonograph in shaping of African-American religion, culture, and politics during the first half of the 20th century. He is currently writing a book tentatively entitled Apostles of Justice: How Hoover's FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Evangelical Conservatism. The book is set to be published by Princeton University Press. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to extend our final welcome for the evening to Dr. Anthony B. Penn. He is the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religion at Rice University. Penn is also the founding director of the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning and the inaugural director of the Center for African and African American Studies at Rice University. Penn's research interests include religion, culture, humanism, and hip hop culture. He is the author and editor of over 35 books, including The Black Church in the Past, The Black Church in Post-Civil Rights Era, Terror and Triumph, The Nature of Black Religion, Noise and Spirit, Rap Music's Religious and Spiritual Sensibilities, in the novel, The Disciples. Penn is also the director of research for the Institute of Humanist Studies, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Welcome, Dr. Penn.
Glad to be with you.
Again, we thank our guests for being with us. And we here at Virginia Union conceived this panel as a way to begin to think about the significance of this cultural moment and what it might signal to us as a Black institution and also a community. VUU has a unique history and formation and legacy that we continue to live into. And we felt it essential to explore this the complexity of this dynamic of how race, religion, and politics intersect in the US, and have our guests illumine for us some of the ways it shapes Black community freedom struggle and expression. Also, given our panelists' expertise, we wanted them to notate some of the ways that they see the complex of race, religion, and politics operative in resistance to African-American progress and what have been violent historical responses to those invested in upholding the white dominant status quo. So to begin our time together this evening, we like each of our panelists in their own way to share some thoughts with us about two things. One, how would you say, and we'll start with Dr. Price if she doesn't mind starting, how would you say understanding the relationship between racial and religious formation in this country is vital to understanding the nature of Black political struggle? Broadly speaking, what does it mean for us understanding how African Americans continue to try to press for a more just and equitable society and more robust life options? So we'll yield now to Dr. Price.
First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to do this. I keep telling all of my Reverend friends, I'm somehow getting more and more on a list of things where I talk about religion. I don't know how that's happening, but I'm going to try to live up to the task. So thank you so much for inviting me. You know, I teach Black politics. I'm a political scientist by training, and that's the thing that I do. But when in every single one of those classes, we all start with one article, and that article is Elsa Barkley Brown's Negotiating and Transforming the Public Sphere. Because I want my students to understand that at the moment that African Americans writ large were emancipated and they had the opportunity to start forming communities, free and open communities, they basically did three things. They built colleges and universities, even though many of them were largely illiterate. They walked around miles and miles to restore kinship ties, to figure out how to recreate or to create new family. And the other thing they did was that they built moral institutions to help guide communities. And so I see those three things as the cornerstone of the African-American community. And those churches were not just religious institutions. That was where many people learned to read. That's where they held political conventions. That's where they held commencements. That's where they held poets and plays. And so they were the center of African-American life. And I think in many ways, it gave us a very different kind of more community-based experience of religion, where the church is not just a place where people go to hear scripture, although they do that. It's a place where they go to also be fed literally, right? It's a place where they go to learn more about what is happening and try to understand and articulate what's happening in their society. And so for me, thinking about race, religion, and justice, those things are inherently intertwined if we are to adhere to our tradition, if we are to adhere to the ingenuity of those first emancipated people. And I would much rather sort of follow what they were doing than some of the things that are happening as we think about how we imagine religion today. Also, I think it's important to think about that moment because in that moment, men, women, and children all had a say in how their lives were going to be handled. It was very much a communal process, right? The notion that women and children did not have a voice in the community was not something that would be heard. Men, women, and children were enslaved. Thus, men, women, and children should have a voice. And I like to think that if we remind our students and we remind people when we talk to them in spaces like this, that the freedom dreams of our ancestors were much more inclusive than even than the current dreams of many of our religious institutions. That they might say, well, when they want to go back, this is the one time in life where I'm like, let's go back. Normally, I'm like, the best day for Black people is tomorrow. But this is the one moment where I'm like, maybe we should rethink what our tradition actually means. And I think I'll stop there. I don't want to take up too much time. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. We really appreciate it. Dr. Phillips.
Thank you for having me. So I entered this conversation from a different perspective, but definitely in line with what Dr. Price said. I entered the conversation from the perspective of Black bodies being identified as 3/5 human. And so I think that that endures even today, not that we are identified as 3/5, but this question of who is American and who counts as American. And so I enter the question from the perspective of this tradition of civil religion, or understood from many perspectives as American national identity, because this question of who is American and who counts as American is an American national identity question. And so if Black bodies were 3/5, they definitely weren't, not only were they not counted as human beings, or interesting or paradoxically enough, human enough to assume particular types of responsibilities on plantations, but not human enough in other respects. And so related to that, given the history of the enslavement of Black bodies, the question of, are they American, continues to come up. It came up with former President Barack Obama with the birther issue. When you bring up birther questions, you are asking, is this, or you are implying that the person is not American, even with a history of labor, enforced labor, and a labor that builds a country. And so what we say is the content of civil religion is, or American national identity, is bloodlines. Bloodlines connected to land and race and religion. And so for African Americans, there is not this claim on a land because of enslavement. And so often when we think about American and Americanness, we think about it in terms of white Christian Protestantism. I know, and there are many discussions about white evangelicalism. And so I'm thinking historically, though, about white Protestantism or white Christianity, and the implication of that being the standard for Americanness, or who is American and what it means to be American. The question came up with the with even Vice President Kamala Harris. Is she American because her parents are are immigrants. Well, yes, if she was born here, that makes her American. And so, so Americanness and how we define who is American is maybe not a question that we sit with as Black Americans or African Americans, but it is central to the democratic project. And if we are going to move forward, we really do have to sit with this question and how we are going to begin to address the question rather than just being angry about a birther movement.
Thanks so much, Dr. Phillips. Both you and Dr. Price hit on themes I want to revisit, you specifically as it relates to civil religion, and Dr. Price pressing us to think about religious and freedom struggle beyond the church, right? And so I really want to come back to those. But let me yield here now for opening statements as well for Dr. Martin here.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's a privilege to be counted in the number. And thank you to my colleagues, Doctors Price and Phillips. And I will only say that amen to what they've said. And I would only add that I think one of the things that's central for me in thinking about Black freedom struggles and religion is two things, both on the moral side, in the sense of the way that African American faith communities have influenced the moral imagination of African Americans, in the sense that despite the experience of enslavement, despite the experience of segregation, discrimination, and naked violence, the way that faith communities allowed for Black folk to imagine a world anew. I think that is something that I've always been fascinated by, something that I think is important within the study and conversation of African American religion. And on the other side, I think about the actual physical aspect, something that both of my colleagues alluded to, and that's the way that African American faith communities played what sociologist Alden Morris always called, sort of movement halfway houses, places where resources were brought together from women who are working as domestics and making making not a lot of money, but still using their few resources for the greater good of the whole. African American men working, blue collar workers bringing their resources together, using their gifts. So those are the two poles I often think about when religion and Black freedom struggle, the way that the moral imagination is tapped and expanded, and then the actual resources of movement building come together within African American faith communities. And I think that there's a question I saw that maybe we'll address later, but I think this is something that we're wrestling with today, even in a Black Lives Matter moment. But I still think it's something that is worth framing our discussions about faith communities, moral imagination, and resources. So I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that.
Thanks, Dr. Martin. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Penn.
Like my colleagues, I'm delighted to be here. And for me, there is an added benefit. Cleve is one of my former students, and I couldn't be prouder. So to spend this time with you this evening is a delight. I'll keep this brief. And I think in most of these conversations, when we say religion, we typically mean Christianity, not even Christianities, but Christianity. I'd like to undercut that and think about religion as what I've called a quest for complex subjectivity, a strategy for meaning making. And it seems to me, in thinking about this relationship between racial and religious formulations, what we have is a vertical response to horizontal crisis. And one of the things that fascinates me about religion is its fungibility, right? So that this vertical response as provided by white supremacy so as to safeguard white privilege understands that there is a moral and ethical crisis here. How do you do this to people and justify it over what Richard Wright calls the long centuries? And so there are ways in which this ethical and theological articulation provided by the white population, if nothing else, numbs this crisis, right? Numbs it enough, distracts enough to allow for persistent disregard. And it seems to me what you get with African Americans, again, is this vertical response to a horizontal crisis, but it tends to rethink this in a way that gives more substance, more meaning to the embodied presence of African Americans who rightfully occupy time and space. On some level, whether you're talking about Black churches, Nation of Islam, Santeria, it really doesn't matter. What you have is a celebration and a pronouncement of rightful occupation of time and space. That there is a kind of existential and ontological robustness to Black life that has to be acknowledged. Over against the demise that is projected by white supremacy, what you get with these various forms of Black religion is a celebration of the persistence of possibility, despite all the persistence of possibility.
Well, thank you all. So you all said a lot for us to kind of try to disentangle, right, and chew on. But I kind of want to start at the point of tension here. Questions I found in my young tenure in teaching that I get from students relates to this sort of tension that we have, right, as it relates to what I would call class disagreements. I think about the Black working poor, right? But in the Black community today, there are different kinds of moral orientation and political strategies for achieving different kind of life options. And we all know it was highlighted in the recent PBS special about how the Black church was engaged in the strategy of teaching Black respectability politics on how to be in the world, right? What that meant for them. But I want to talk about that about a bit. I mean, because even all of us, we're trained and we're taught to say education is the way to go, right? We're taught about how to engage in kind of language games around learning dominant discourses. But I want you all to talk a bit about what's often called Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham and Frey respectability politics. How is that both, yes, been a means of progress for us? I mean, we teach our Black youth, right? We want to train them in middle class values, right? Go to school, get education, speak right, dress the right way, and that's the way to progress. But what we see and what you kind of alluded to in the Black Lives Matter movement and all these things is sometimes that tends to invisibilize certain people. So talk about Black respectability politics, not only the churches, but all of these religions, how they participate in kind of cultivating that, and what are the harms and also prospects you see in that. I want us to talk about these things that are not often talked about as it relates to that. Now, you all yield. I'll let you all yield to each other as colleagues on how you want to go.
Well, I'll attempt to be brave here, and I'll step out on faith, as they would say. So you know, I wrestle with this, and here's what I wrestle with this. So I come to this as someone who is shaped by questions of history. So I approach this as a historian, and I think that some of the things that you've named are absolutely correct. But I want to make a distinction between what Evelyn Higginbotham meant when she coined the term in the moment versus how it has been deployed. And I think those are two different things. I think when Evelyn's talking about this as a historical moment, it is a strategy that was advocated in a way that would help to either tear down structural ideas of racism and racial stereotypes, or could actually help to buttress racism. And I think she's very clear that this is a strategy that was in a particular moment used by not necessarily elites as we would think about it, but actually working Black women. And I think that that's the sort of historical definition. And I think that it's been deployed in ways today that maybe are not quite fair to what Evelyn originally was trying to argue. Now, I think that today, yes, I think that this idea that somehow if we dress a certain way, talk a certain way, that somehow that is going to inoculate us from racism, I think that obviously we clearly see that is just not true, right? We live these lives and we see this is not true. But I'm not quite sure that that's ever what Evelyn meant when she was writing. So I'll start with that, and I'll be quiet from there and see how this plays out.
It's important to say that it's not just what she meant, but those people who were talking about respectability politics in the time that she's writing, they also knew that it wasn't going to fix everything, right? They were not suggesting that if you pulled your pants up and if you dressed, wore a dress below your knee, that all of a sudden all the sexual violence aimed at Black women would end, right? They really were trying to figure out, Black people of all generations are constantly trying to figure out survival strategies to meet the moment that they are in, right? And so I think the thing that people are pushing back against when they mention respectability politics is really what they want to say is, I don't want to do this like my grandmother did it, or I don't want to be beholden to the morals of my parents, right? Because even some of the stuff that your parents are doing is not even the respectability politics that Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham was talking about. And your parents are aware of the fact that you can be as polite as you want to police officers and you still might not get shot. And so to give benefit of the doubt on both sides, I think is really important in that. But I also think, part of this discussion about respectability politics is really about wanting to sort of tear down certain kinds of cultural mores. And I sometimes wish people would say that rather than just dismiss it as respectability politics, right? Rather than just dismiss it, say, here's an option that I want to put on the table as a new way of doing this thing, as a new way of going about this process, right? Rather than just sort of using it as a way to buck against generations. And I think sometimes to buck against people you just disagree with, right? So if you're in a meeting screaming at everybody and I'm like, don't scream at me, and you're like, that's respectability politics, I'm like, I won't respect, actually. Right, you're right. I want to be respected. And what I don't do is, as a grown woman, have people yell at me. And so you have to stop it, right? So there's all kinds of ways that we can play this thing out. But I think what really it mostly is a cry by young people for the opportunity to try to do a new thing. That's my generous reading of it.
I want to dovetail and thank Dr. Martin for the historical summary and Dr. Price for the nuance. But I think also the respectability politics is a cry against older generations. And so I think it's also being used as a tool to say that the Black church has become a Black middle class institution that is not aware of what is happening in the streets and does not want to get its nails dirty. I think that and often I have my colleague, Dr. Brandon McCormick, to come to my class and talk about the Black Lives Matters movement, or talk about what is perceived because of the Black Lives Matters movement as a generational divide. So you have the millennials and the Generation Zers in some respects against the Generation Xers. We're the silent generation, right? And then the civil rights generation was, in terms of contemporary times, and I do history, but I'm not the historian, but in terms of contemporary times, is the reference point for Black Lives Matter. And so amongst sociologists, the question raises and is raised, as well as other scholars, is Black Lives Matter a social movement or a social moment? Well, I'm going to say it's a social movement. And the railing against respectability politics is that the Black church has become reified in certain practices and in particular behaviors and thought patterns, and won't come down from where it is to where the people are. And so I think we also have to, and it's interesting that they're using the tool respectability politics, to critique a middle class Black church. And so as Dr. McCormick shared with us, they're saying this ain't your grandmama's social movement. That's loaded. It could also say grandmama is now middle class, and we are not necessarily, nor do we come from working class. We come from lower middle class, because the reality is that in terms of Black Lives Matter, it grows out of more disenfranchised and lower income Black communities. Not that if you are middle class and upper middle class Black, you can't be stopped by the police, but, and we have the political scientist here, so she can give us the stats, but it increases when you are in lower income communities. And so we have to take it seriously as a critique against the Black church. Although I wouldn't go as far, and I'm just going to leave this here because I have a lot more to say about that. I don't want to have it go as far as to say that there has to be a division between the civil rights generation and the and millennials and Generation Zers, who are the leaders of this present movement.
There isn't anything that's been said I would disagree with. I would simply add that everything that's been said so far, it seems to me, points to another dimension of respectability politics. That is the way in which it signifies, right? It forces a recognition that there's a type of anti-Black racism undergirding all this logic that makes it impossible for Black folks to abide by dominant social and cultural codes in a way that will shift life for them. You can't wear a suit that will make a difference, right? You can't live in a neighborhood that will make a difference. You can't speak in a way that will make a difference, right? You can't arrange your family in a way that will make a difference, right? It points out the underlying toxic of anti-Black racism. I'd also say that we often fail to celebrate the flip side of this. And for me, the flip side is a kind of irreverence as a strategy of engagement. And so I think about folks like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner or Bishop Reverdy C. Ransom, for whom the dynamics of life are such that the proper response of Black folks is to openly reject these moral and cultural codes established by the dominant population. And someone like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner did that in terms of rhetoric. He did it in terms of aesthetic. He did it in terms of how he occupied time and space, right? This is the guy who in 1895 in Atlanta, Georgia, argues that God is a Negro, right? This is the one who argues that the US flag is a dirty rag until Black folks are treated properly. This is the guy who in general conferences, folks snickered because his suit was wrinkled and ill-fitting, right? So this is, it seems to me, in addition to this kind of respectability politics, there is and has always been a kind of irreverence as a strategy over against dominant social and moral codes.
Wow, this is rich, and I kind of want to stay in this area a minute. So you'll have a chance to come back. I want to give each of you a chance to come back. But a tangential question related to it, and I also want to shout out, these are questions from students that they say they don't really hear addressed directly often, right? So I want to pivot to another one, students and also Twitterverse, right? On the one hand, right, there's great celebration, adulation at Kamala Harris, the first African-American woman, first woman of Asian descent as well, being elected as vice president. And then I'm sure you all have heard though, but representation is not what? Liberation, right? So on the one hand, how can we both, on the one hand, celebrate electoral politics making some progress, Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. On the other hand, how do we address concerns that, no, I'm not celebrating with y'all. What I'm trying to say to y'all, this is not doing it for us, right? And this is what we see, of course, by youth and young Black activists as well. So I want you all to kind of stand in this area, speak to that as well. How do I celebrate at the same time, hold a critical kind of orientation toward what's going on in electoral politics?
You know, this is the moment where I tell my students that Black people have the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have the ability to think about things on multiple levels, and we have to, because it's how we survive. We are constantly thinking about the way we actually live and the way we have to walk through the world. And so thinking about Kamala Harris in more than one way is actually something I push my students to do, right? We should not be thinking about anybody who is in electoral office as just a thing, right? And so representation is important. And Black firsts are rarely people who are the most rebellious, or rarely only the Black revolutionaries are actually the first Black revolutionaries. But Black people who end up in positions like this are often people who have figured out a way to make it through a racist system and still be both palatable to African Americans and white people at the same time. And so that Kamala Harris is the person that she is, that Barack Obama is the person that they are, and they get to be first, is highly predictable. But it's also important to know that that is not substance, right? And substance she can offer a substance. I'm not suggesting that she won't, but I'm suggesting also that it's often important for us to think about these things. And so no one is asking you to celebrate the fact that she's giving us substance, because she hasn't done her job yet. We're asking you to think about what it means for an African-American woman who graduated from a historically Black college, who is a member of and is tied to rooted historical Black institutions, to become vice president. Then when she does her job, we're asking you to think about all those things we knew about her that we liked while she was applying for the job. Did they matter in the end? Those are two separate questions that have to be answered. And I think Black people are clearly capable of doing that, including our young Black students.
Let me jump in here. Another way of thinking about Vice President Kamala Harris is to think about her in terms of her, specifically her biraciality, her hybridity. And the ways in which, and not using the term hybrid in a derogatory way, but looking at hybridity as being able to defy political expectations. So having this, being able to disrupt alterity, being able to disrupt what it means to be other, because you are deconstructing the dominant culture, and also bringing in the voice of those that are marginalized. So hybrids have this, or I don't want to say hybrids and put a life to the term, but I do want to say the concept of hybridity defies political expectations, disrupts dominant culture, brings in that which is usually silenced and marginalized to create something new. And so when we look at her, or when we looked at former President Barack Obama, we didn't, it's so easy to identify, I guess we say BIPOCs, you know, Blacks, Indigenous, people of color as others, but in terms of and focus on alterity, focus on this othering. But with respect to their hybridity, they were able to create something new and cross boundaries. Now, the issue with hybridity, and this was an issue with former President Barack Obama, the hybridity had a cross-racial appeal and allowed for a type of racial inclusivity, but not racial specificity. And we want our Black political leaders to be able to identify with what it means to be Black in America. And so often we heard, well, yes, he's the first president of African descent, but I hope you don't expect that he would only address the African American condition or the Black condition in America. And then you heard retorts of, well, he is, and he identifies as Black. And so, yes, the expectation is that he would be specific in addressing the Black social and political condition. And so I want us to think about her in the same way. Will she, as her tenure unfolds, how will she, maybe the question is, how will she continue to have the cross-racial appeal that got her into office, yet she too identifies as a Black woman? We say Black and Asian, she says Black because her mama said she was a Black woman. Will she be able to address where she is and where she stands, the Black social and political condition?
You know, and I would only add to this that I just, it's a question and not an answer, so I apologize. But I agree with everything that's been said. And I wonder if, I want to hit on this again, will she be able to be as, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm thinking about what Nicole has said and what Melanie said. I'm wondering if, will she be able to be as mobile and slippery in this regard as Barack was, because she's a woman, right? Barack was, okay, I got my answer already. I mean, Barack, as you point in your book, was able to use these sort of strategies, and he was able to do so. And I think he was able to do so in some parts because he's a man. But I wonder, will she be able to be as slippery? Because we've seen the kind of box that women are put in oftentimes when they get on the national stage and in terms of politics. You know, we saw this whether, Black or white women, right? We saw it in some ways with Hillary, right? Either you're too soft or you're too angry, right? Or whatever it may be. So I'm wondering, that's also the question about with her, but will she be able to have the dexterity that Barack had? And I think our dear political scientist has answered the question, so I'm just going to stop.
I think Vice President Harris troubles the national narrative, right? Her presence demonstrates how flawed, how bulky and awkward the vocabulary and grammar we've used to construct our understanding of collective life, how difficult and how troubling that grammar and vocabulary is. But undergirding the question for me is, I sense an assumption of outcome-driven strategies, and I have difficulties with outcome-driven strategies for a variety of reasons. But here I'll just say that it seems to me it suggests that struggle is linear. And from my vantage point, outcome-driven strategies are difficult in that they restrict what we do to what we think we can win. Right, and so my argument would be these sorts of outcome-driven strategies diminish imagination and harm our ability to do what Robin Kelly called dreaming. Right, it short circuits risk.
Thanks to all of you for such a humbling. Before I go to the next, I also want to say to those who are attending, if you have any questions, there is a question and answer section in box there. Submit them. If the conversation if we're able to stop, we'll leave at least 20 minutes for questions and answers, but I'm not going to interrupt our panelists here. But if you have questions or concerns, anything that's burning, please submit them in the question and answer box, not the chat, the question and answer box, and then we will come back and try to moderate that with the last 15 minutes or so. So I want to pivot now to really, the reason why a lot of these convenings are happening, right? The January 6th incident at the Capitol, right? And one thing that struck me was, right, and everybody was the state responses to white rage versus state responses to Black protests, right? Talk about the differences in responses to that, not only from the police, but also our government officials, and what that says about the management and control in Black bodies, and what that means for upholding the U.S. order or U.S. racial order, I would say it. How is management of Black bodies really key to upholding white supremacy in this country as you have seen it?
I'll start. I don't know if I have an answer for that, but one of the things that was affirmed for everybody that Black people already knew last summer is that you can die exercising, you can die walking down the street, you can die sleeping in your bed, and that there's virtually no space for which the Black body cannot policed by not just law enforcement officers, but by individual white citizens, right? And that in fact it is sometimes easier to exact punishment from individual white senators, individual citizens, than it is from the people we pay taxes to protect, that we provide taxes for to protect us. And so we are all sort of grappling with that, and everybody watching that, including white people, knew that that thing that happened in the Capitol would have been a mass slaughter if African Americans were there. They wouldn't have thought twice about the shootings. They wouldn't have been as concerned about pulling their guns. They wouldn't have, the National Guard wouldn't have waited for commands. They would be running over to that Capitol without any instruction, preparing to take it back. And so we understand this as a way of life, and are trying to, Black Lives Matter, but not just Black Lives Matter, civil rights organizations in general are trying to grapple with what this actually means, about the ways in which we find ourselves every generation having to confirm our citizenship over and over and over again, and the ways in which when Black people die, it becomes about their character and not about whether or not they should be allowed to live, right? And so, you know, January 6th tells us a lot. We know that there was a white supremacist conspiracy involved. We know that they came there armed. I mean, people don't show up to rallies with spears unless they're trying to spear something. People don't show up to rallies with zip ties and guns unless they're trying to shoot people. And the thing that we know for sure is that people at Black Lives Matter movement rallies in large part are showing up with backpacks full of water and ways to get tear gas out of their eyes. They're showing up with tools to prevent their own physical harm for the most part, not to engage in harm of other people. And in fact, when they're engaged in peaceful protest, mothers drop their underage children off with high-powered weapons that are allowed to then shoot them. We all know that, and there's no better way of saying it, and it is the most heartbreaking part of being called that thing called Black and American, and we all understand it. I don't have an answer or a solution. It's just the way that I'm sort of thinking about it.
I think we've made a mistake, and we've assumed that the United States needs Black people, and it does not need Black people. It needs Blackness. And individual Black bodies are objects to be manipulated to safeguard whiteness, right? But what it needs is Blackness. Black bodies will always be out of place. I think one of the things that became very clear for us with the election of Donald Trump moving forward is the way in which whiteness is the end goal. We assumed that politics was about re-election. But it seems to me what we learned from the election of Donald Trump moving forward is politics is about the safeguarding and advancement of whiteness, not the safeguarding of office, the safeguarding of whiteness.
Wow.
Yes, that's something that you definitely have to sit with. But we also recognize that this is historical, right? There has always been a before January 6th. And I am cognizant that January 6th happened because Georgia happened, right? As well as the election of our two senators happened. And that, I think that was the maybe the final straw. All right. But Make America Great Again is a color-coded message. It's a color-coded message about and going back to using nostalgia, using time to say there was a time where Black bodies were put in their place, where there was, spaces were circumscribed, and Black bodies weren't allowed without permission in certain social spaces. At this very moment in one of my classes, we're reading through Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and though it is about mass incarceration and the ways in which there's this attempt to place Black men, Black and brown bodies, but particularly Black men, in a permanent caste system, she gives a history of why we are where we are now. And the use of, when I hear Make America Great Again, when I hear, what does he call, recently with the, I forget the name of the boys, but the bottom line is this call to law and order when there really has been no evidence of Black bodies being disorderly, but a call to law and order to circumscribe Black bodies into particular social spaces. And so I think that we should not, and I mean, I was aghast when I was flipping through the channels and watching on January 6th, but I wasn't surprised, because for every, and I love what Omi and Winant say, for every despotic practice and action, there are democratic practices and actions. And so there's always going to be a tug of war between the despotic and the democratic. There's always going to be a tug of war between placing Latino bodies in cages, enslavement, near genocide of indigenous peoples, despotic practices, as opposed to democratic practices, which is American dreaming, right? And so, I mean, that would be my response to January 6th, that we need to recognize that there is always going to be this tension between the despotic and the democratic, the despotic practices and the democratic project, as well as January 6th is just a reification or a reflection of historically this attempt to circumscribe Black bodies.
Awesome. There are two questions I want to make sure I get to before we conclude. We only have one question now, so we have room here for these, and I want to make sure we do that. I intentionally wanted to not only center Blackness in our conversation, but also make sure that we kind of get at that it's not just about struggle per se. So I want to ask this question that me and my colleague was talking about while we recognizing injustice, how do we avoid reducing the Black community and institutional life simply to struggle, right? How do we draw more attention to a lot of the constructive work being done? Now, Dr. Martin kind of hinted at that when he talked about, look, churches have been these great places for creating moral imagination, right? But let's talk about that more. How do we talk about Blackness and in its robustness with folks, right? And I want to hear from you about that.
It seems to me one thing we have to do is stop assuming that the Black church is the litmus test, right? Stop assuming that the well-being of the Black church is synonymous with the well-being of the Black community. From my perspective, what that means is we only look at that institution for the ways in which Black folks have spoken their truth. But why not, in terms of that question, why not give attention to the ways in which the arts have provided an alternate vision of life, right? Have pushed us to wrestle with profound questions, have encouraged us to imagine, right? Why not turn to the arts? If you're interested in ways in which Black folks have celebrated their occupation in time and space, look to the arts.
Are you done? I don't want to. Okay, good. You know, I've been teaching. I didn't know if it was like a ministerial pregnant pause, and you were gonna hit us with something else. So, you know, I've been teaching Black studies for many years, almost 20 years now. And one of the things that all of you know who have done this, when you teach any classes about race, especially things that students are less familiar with, by the somewhere in the middle of the semester, they're so angry they don't know what to do with themselves. They're so emotionally wrought about why didn't they know this, about how could all of these things happen, about why do Black people have to go through all of these things. They just don't know what to do with themselves. And they're like, but you don't seem to be mad. And I'm like, first of all, I've been teaching this a long time, so it numbs you. Second of all, have you met Black people? Right? I mean, they experience all these things, and yet, like, Black people are excellent at Black comedy. Why? Because they have had to figure out, I mean, dark comedy, because they have had to figure out how to find joy, how to create spaces in the midst of things that they know should not be happening to them, in the midst of things that they know are unjust, in the midst of rules that they know are ridiculous, and yet they still manage to create beauty. They still manage to create loveliness. They still manage to be tender with their children and their lovers. They still manage all of these things. And so you always have to be mixing the struggle with the things that come along with that. So in the middle of the civil rights movement, when you listen to them talk, like if you study some of that stuff, you look at SNCC, they were still arguing about boyfriends. They were still figuring out where they were going to get their hair pressed after somebody dumped a plate on the top of their heads, right? They were still trying to figure out the mundane and the beautiful in the midst of the struggle. And if you only focus in on the struggle, then in fact, what you miss is what Black people are doing all around that. And that is the dancing around that struggle is the beauty of Black people. It is in fact it's why they're more fun at parties, right? It's why they're more enjoyable to hang out with. It's why when you're when Black people are together in a restaurant having a loud conversation, everybody wants to join in, right? Because they're trying to figure out, how are these people who I view as less than me, these people I view as inferior, these people I view as unnecessary, how the hell are they so happy and funny? How the hell are they so joyful? Because that's the magic of the Black imagination.
I think that Dr. Penn and Dr. Price already said it. I mean, despite right, despite the tragic comic, despite that being our story, our narrative, we're the creative always emerges. I mean, from the brush harbors and the hush harbors in the midst of slavery, in the creation of Black worship, even under the seeing eye of the slave master, to now to hip hop culture, okay? And even with hip hop culture being commodified, hip hop artists still use, even though, I mean, they're speaking about the condition, they're personal as well as communal. And they also bring in religion and some of the artistry, the lyricism, et cetera, brings in the religious and speaks to Black people and the ways in which Black people use religion. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's much more to say than that the creative still emerges despite the tragic comic.
Love the way you phrased that. I appreciate that, Dr. Phillips. One last question before I turn to questions and answers. And full disclosure, I tell all of you on the panel and who's listening, I emailed Dr. Price at least 3 times, say, listen, this ain't gonna work unless you come, because you at HBCU. I just got it. Please say yes, you know. And I did it for this reason. I want to turn to this question. Dr. Penn knows as my advisor and mentor, I intentionally wanted to come to VU and was excited because of my commitments to the Black community and also being at HBCU. But as well, I want you all to think about what's going on in this moment, right? What about HBCUs in this moment? What shifts do you think might be happening? If you think about all the donations now to HBCUs and all of the DEI appointments at PWIs, right? What do you see as some of the opportunities and challenges presented to Black scholars as a whole? Dr. Penn has this movement now with VUU about Black leaders across campuses. What do we see? How do you see we can spur more collaborations either between Black scholars at these institutions? And do you see a movement of folk maybe wanting to come back to HBCUs given some of the lack of resources or whatever? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. It's funny that you say you have a collaboration with Dr. Penn, because I too am involved in a collaboration with him. So apparently he is around building bridges all over the place, which I think is, wonderful. We're working on forming a regional sort of African-American studies consortium with Texas Southern, Prairie View, University of Houston, and Rice. And so good on him for being a bridge builder, because I don't know if it would have gotten done if it was left to me and my devices. I spent most of my career at PWIs. Prairie View is not just where I work, it is also my alma mater. And I came home because of the leadership that we had, because Ruth Simmons came there and she said, will you come? And people go where she tells you, literally you go where she tells you. And the thing I will say is yesterday, Jelani Favors, who has a new book called Shelter in the Time of Storms, about HBCUs and their fostering activism, is talked about the fact that this is not just a moment where people are looking at HBCUs, and they are, right? This is where people are trying to figure out how to give big donations, how to get involved in collaborations and partnerships, and all of that is wonderful. But it also is a moment, he said, and I agree with, for HBCUs to really be introspective and to think about sort of how they're going to make an imprint with this newfound, as people move. And it's a temporary thing. It's not going to last. How they're going to use this moment to not just build up their own individual institutions, but to think about what kinds of work needs to be done in those spaces. I am very fortunate in that I have been given sort of free rein to do some projects that really focus on shoring up how we understand African-American studies. And so one of the projects that I'm most proud of is that we're starting a BA program in African-American studies, but a key component of that is that they will be required to do public history. So all the students who do African-American studies at Prairie View will have to do an internship in public history. They will have to take public history classes, because if we're not the stewards of our own story, then who is? And so it's that kind of work related to building archives and those kinds of things. And I think that there are ways for faculty to be brought into these spaces, if not permanently, then certainly as fellows, certainly as visitors. And I hope that people, and I know some of the money that we're raising for my new center, we're looking to do fellowship programs and things like that. Many HBCUs don't have the capacity to give you a sabbatical every 3 years, or to let you teach 1.5 classes, or all of these things that you are required to do. But certainly you can come in and spend time in our space if you don't choose to teach there. If you can come in and think about ways that you can collaborate with people in our spaces, you can say, you know, as you're moving through places, as you're traveling for your book tour, if you come to Houston, say Anthony invites you to Houston, but that's right by Texas Southern. Can you figure out a way to visit Texas Southern while you're there? And part of it will take extra work because it isn't the same level of resources. And so if you are expecting HBCUs to do the things that Harvard does on the crumbs of what Harvard's, it's the crumbs of the crumbs that Harvard leaves on the table. If you're expecting them to do the things that they do, if that's the kind of experience you want as a professor, this is not going to be the place for you. But if you want to actually be at a place where, you know, 70% of the kids are Pell Grant eligible, 60% of the kids at our school are first generation college students. And so when you get them across the finish line, you are changing the financial, the intellectual trajectory of an entire family. I know because it changed mine, right? And so if you're interested in doing that kind of work, then sometimes, like in the Black church, I think that being in the Black church helped me with this tremendously. Like in the Black church, you sometimes have to deal with stuff that just gets on your nerves. I was the chair of the trustees at a church, at my church, before I came here. And the thing you know is, in order to have the joy and the things I love about it, I still got to deal with the BS. And you have to admit that you're dealing with BS wherever you are. And don't act like, you know, this Black college stuff is just the BS. There's BS everywhere. If we went offline and we got rid of all of these participants and had a conversation, every single one of us would have a story. And I think those are the kinds of things that are important. And so as we think about what we do, can you partner with somebody at a Black college? Can you offer them the ability to lecture in your course? Is there a fellowship and you know at your school and you know somebody at an HBCU? Can you figure out how they can apply? Because they're teaching 3-4 classes, 5. But they're also teaching a third of your engineers. They're also teaching the majority of your doctors, your Black doctors. They're also teaching your nurses. They're teaching your teachers. And so if you want your kid to go to a Black school, you don't have to work at one, but you certainly need to support one. If you want your kid to have a Black teacher, you don't have to work at one, but you certainly need to support one. Like, if you start thinking about it in that way, it changes the nature of PWIs versus HBCUs. That's nonsense. People need to work, and they work where they work for all kinds of reasons. The question is, are you using your choices to disparage other people's choices? Are you using your choices to act like you're doing something saintly by ignoring Black colleges because the leadership is so bad, when the leadership at your university just told you that Black people ain't good at nothing all the time, right? It's that, I don't want to, anyway, let me stop. That's enough. That's enough of that. I could go on forever.
May I ask a question of my fellow panelists who either were educated at HBCUs or work at HBCUs? How much of an impact do you think that Vice President Kamala Harris is going to have in terms of getting Black families interested in sending their children to HBCUs, or, you know, or an increase in terms of monetary resources to HBCUs? Because, you know, when she was elected, of course, Divine Nine was all over my Facebook page, okay? All over my Facebook page. And so I wonder about that. And then this is just a comment. And I think for those of us who mainly attended PWIs and have children who are college age, I see a lot of my friends' children choosing, young adults choosing to attend HBCUs because of the current national political and social moment. So that's my question.
Yeah, you know, I think you're absolutely right. We're in a moment right now where when our kids So I grew up in the 80s, and there was racism, but people understood if you called me a nigga that you probably were gonna get your behind whooped. Like people understood that. Now, there's a return of this kind of belligerence where people are just yelling all kinds of stuff at kids at basketball games, and these kids are like, I don't want it. And so they are rethinking, it's a moment where people are rethinking historically Black colleges as sort of a shelter, right? As sort of a bubble for them to exist in. And so you're starting to see the enrollments go up. And I think that will continue. And then at some point, things will seem calmer again, and then people will, their attentions will move away. I think it's cyclical. I think also, what is also important to think about when you do that is, people should be thinking about Black colleges like they think about all colleges. They are in fact different, right? Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger. Some of them have a very science focus, some of them don't. There are all these ways, but we don't think about them in that way. And often what we're doing is we're thinking about 3 of them, right? We're thinking about the ones that we see on TV, right? We're thinking about certain names of them when there are in fact over 100. And so as you think about 100 of anything, they look really different. They behave really differently. They have different kinds of leaderships. They offer different kinds of things. And so as we've been talking today, we've been talking a lot about nuance and thinking about Black people in terms of nuance. Just give some of that generosity for me to historically Black colleges as well. Allow them to be nuanced, allow them to be different. And the thing is, it's like people like, I hate Black colleges because they never call you back. Well, it turns out you go to white colleges and they never call on you in class, and yet you sit there. Right? And you are persistent. You will be heard. You are doing all of these things. And so think about Black colleges in these same ways. That's all I ask. And where you send your child is up to you. What you do with your money and your job is up to you. But the thing I'm going to say is have a little generosity. Think about the ways in which you might be able to be of use. Don't show up thinking that you are going to be the person who is going to change everything that ever happened. If you ever step foot in a church or you try to pastor a church, you know that you walk in thinking you're going to change everything. And then within 2 years, they have changed you. Think about these kinds of think about these kinds of things, because some things are very slow. I do walk into offices and I'm like, dear Miss So-and-so. I wouldn't do that at a white university. I'd be like, Sheila, give me the thing you owe me. Like but you have to do these kinds of things. And if you don't want to do them, it's not the place. It's not the place for you. And so think about those things. Thank you for asking me that.
Awesome. We have about 15 more minutes. I first wanted to just extend my sincere thanks to all of you for agreeing to come. And Dr. Price, your last answer is one of the main reasons why I wanted to come. So thank you so much for coming. And you helped me. You'll realize you just gave me a counseling session. I really appreciate that already. We have about 4 or 5 questions that we want to turn to. I want to turn over yield now to my colleagues, Dr. O'Shea and Mr. Parker. If you would, we will have a time for about 2 or 3 questions. And so Dr. O'Shea, if you would come and let's field some questions from our audience now.
Okay, we have a number of really good questions, and one I'd like to make sure to get in front of people is this. It says, in the dialectical tension, sadly even terror, between Blackness and whiteness, or white rage over Black protest, where are you finding hope? Hope for Black bodies, hope for peace with justice, hope for our generation and our students' generation. So where is hope in this moment?
I always find hope in the fact that Black people continue to try to make this a better country gives me hope. And the thing really when people should be afraid is when Black people stop protesting, because that's when they've given up the notion that they will ever be a part of this thing we call the American project. And even these kids who are out in the streets who are 18, 19 years old, who are talking about they have given up on the American project, the thing we know for sure is that they wouldn't be out there if they hadn't. And so politicians, if they had any sense, would take that as a sign that here is a group of people who you have given no reason to continue to participate, and yet they continue to try. And that is the thing that's always going to give you hope. If you look to politicians to give you hope, then you're going to lose every time, because they are driven by votes. They are driven by public opinion polls. They are driven by the desire to stay in power. Those kids who are out there in that street, they are driven by a desire to be seen and heard and felt. And that is the place where I always find hope.
Okay,
Is it just, did you want to? Because I think Dr. Price said a whole word. So I don't really need to say anything.
okay.
Do you want to move on to the next question? It's okay.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fine. Well, here's another. It's and this is a much shorter one. It says, how can Black people prevent their resilience from being used as permission for further oppression, like in racial capitalism, other kinds of forms? How does that resilience stop being transformed into a permission to oppress?
I think that's a challenging question, because how can I mean, the how is in how can we do that? But I think about it in terms of how the domestic turned global Black Lives Matter movement unfolded last summer, and the fact that white allies said, you have to be careful that we as white people don't co-opt this movement to our benefit. And so I think first, maybe having allies, coalition building, not feeling like you're the only Black people. Oh, you know what? Sharing the responsibility. This isn't like, I think about Du Bois. What does it mean to be a problem? This isn't just our problem. This is everybody's problem, right? When a group of people are being denigrated and dehumanized, it's a civil rights issue, it's a human rights issue, it is a humanity problem. It's not just a Black person's problem. So coalition building, creating, having white allies, and having people who are willing to be truth tellers. So I appreciated listening to a colleague say, you know, it seems like at some point, Black Lives Matter was becoming commercialized, and not because of the young people who were the leaders of the movement, who are in the streets really protesting, but it almost was becoming kind of sexy, right? And so having people who are willing to be truth tellers and to cross racial lines to tell the truth. So having a white person say, hey, this doesn't look quite right. I think that would be my answers in process, but that is the beginning of the answer for me.
And quickly, I would just say it also depends on how we describe our misery. That one of the challenges the Black church has posed for us kind of revolves around this, and it centers on redemptive suffering models, right? That if you see anything of value, even secondary value in one's misery, you open up to, well, this may not be such a bad thing. We're doing you a favor. No cross, no crown.
Sorry, one other question I want to make sure I get to, I see here. Outside of the Black church and middle class Black community and masses, including our youth, the first Black has made it, quote unquote. Black communities are looking for folks to represent them and support progressive policy that addresses systemic issues. If you agree with this statement, namely that Blacks are looking for people who will support progressive policy, why do you think the Black church and Black middle class are out of alignment oftentimes with the rest of folk? They seem to have, the other folks seem to have more patience than typically Black church and Black middle class, this person is arguing.
One of the things I have to say that I don't accept is that progressivism has to be found outside of the Black church. I don't believe that. I don't buy it as a principle. I think often when people say that, I ask, what Black churches are you looking at? Right? The most popular churches are often those that might meet that kind of criteria where they have this Black sensibility. But I know for a fact, because I attend one, that you can go to a church that is both Baptist and gives you the tradition of a Baptist church, but is still accepting of LGBT families. I know it's possible. And so one of the things that we have to stop doing is acting like the church commands something and that we are in fact not the church. Right? That the people are not the church, that you can't in fact be in the church and have a voice, right? That is to accept that a place that I spent most of my childhood, that was my community center, that was my training ground, that taught me to be able to speak to you like I'm speaking to you today. It is to forfeit that place to people who don't share my politics. And I refuse to do that. And I want to encourage other people to consider not doing that as well. And I also don't forfeit it to the middle class, because I was not middle class and I spent a lot of time in there. And most of the people who are making churches run are not middle class. And so they might be aspirationally middle class, because it turns out that most Americans are, because most people in fact don't want to be poor, because being poor is to suffer. And so I want us to sort of rethink how we even frame the notion of the Black church and how we think about the Black church. But on top of that, the other thing is, I love that my good friend Tracy Blackman loves to remind us that the church can happen in the streets. And that in fact, she has been out in the street. She has been out protesting. She is actively involved with Black Lives Matter activists, and she is not always in buildings when she's doing it. And so it is up to us as people who are of this tradition and who want to remain in this tradition to force it to rethink itself. Otherwise, it will be taken over by these people who have been infiltrated by white evangelicals, who are being taught by people in seminaries, by Southern Baptists who actually hate Black people. Otherwise, they will win the day, and there will be no place for you to go to remember your childhood. There will be no place for you to go to rekindle those feelings that you had as a child. It will not exist, because we will have ceded that territory. And I won't cede that territory. And I won't sit under people who say things that are hellaciously oppressive, because I have both a voice and I have my ability to think for myself as a person who is a religious person. And so I would say the first thing I would do is disentangle those things, take those things away, look for a progressive. And let me offer you up something. That progressive is probably a woman. So think about who you need your pastor to be as well, right? Think about, will you sit up under a woman's leadership, under a feminist leadership, under a progressive leadership? Think about those kinds of things, challenge those kinds of things, right? Think about, will you go to a place where they don't have no screens? And it's not about mega churches. Like, this is the thing I've been thinking about so much. It's not about mega churches. So in the 1890s, when the church I went to, St. Paul's, marched from its small building to its larger building, they did it with 2,000 people in the 1890s. So it's not about the size of the church, it's about the theology. It's not about the size, it's about the theologies, the questions you should be asking yourself and your fellow religious travelers is, why do they find this stuff so attractive? Why do they want this? And part of it is because who don't want to feel good and hear them Joel Osteen stories? I mean, it makes you feel better, but it doesn't help liberate anybody, ever.
And I'll only add to that, I completely agree with you. And I think one of the reasons is I don't think it's about necessarily the size of the church, Dr. Price. I agree with you. But I think when mega churches have been able to harness is advancement in communication technology. And so they appear to be the loudest voices, right? Because we hear Osteen, but not just Osteen, right? We got Brother Creflo Dollar, we got other folks as well who are communicating a kind of individualized gospel that is only about making your life better, how you can accentuate and be the best you can be. But I'm fortunate, like yourself. I went to progressive churches, and there's someone I believe who's jumping online with us now, Reverend Ray Marshall, who happened to be my roommate in seminary, who was a progressive minister in the Black Presbyterian Church, who I'm very thankful and blessed to know. And I think he is one person who reminds me that there is a way that you can have an educated ministry and a ministry that is expressive, a ministry that engages in Black worship traditions and yet not lose the progressive aspects of Black Christianity. Oftentimes, I think people think they have to sacrifice the two, right? Either I'm going to go somewhere and shout, which means the preacher he or she may not be educated, but we're going to sing well, we're going to worship well, and I'm going to have a good time, and then I'll just turn off the sermon. I think, we have preachers out there that maybe they're not on television, but they're embodying the kind of ministry which you speak. And I think that we have to remember that and not allow the other face of these mega churches to become the face of the African-American religious experience. But we have a whole host of experiences, many of which are progressive, especially as it relates to ideas of sexuality and gender norms. And so I'm with you on that. And I'm really thankful that we still have a remnant out there who are doing this kind of work across the country.
And just quickly, it seems to me, I would agree with Drs. Price and Martin. It seems to me that the modes of expression for Black folks, the ways in which we've demanded personhood has never been restricted to just the Black church, right? That there have been a range of ways in which we have demanded personhood. We've understood that we needed more than one tool to create a new world in the same way you can't build a house with just a hammer. And so it seems to me we have to paint a rather rich and deep picture of the strategies Black folks have put in place to demand something other than what they have, right? The strategies we have put in place to name the unnameable. I also want to be mindful of the growing number of African Americans who claim no particular religious tradition, but are still finding community and forging a way through the world.
Well, thanks so much to all of our panelists.
All right, Cleve, can I add that I think and a lot of that is happening is because we are not helping people articulate their spiritual needs and beliefs well in churches anymore. And so they end up, like, I know people who listen to gospel, they study the Bible, but they don't go to church. And part of it is because I think of the oversized voice of certain kinds of ministries, right? And so the only way they can find themselves still in touch with the things that might root them in some ways is to move away from it. And we want to discourage that as much as possible. I think we do.
And I think I agree with you, and not just a religious experience. Again, that is just about self-actualization, right? That is actually goes back to how we started this panel and about community. And whether that community or meaning making, as Dr. Penn has said, happens within the four walls of a Baptist church or happens on the street corner or wherever it may be, we've got to have an ability to get back to this idea that faith, a central core of faith is always about community and not just about being the best, a better you. And I think that that's the kind of message that sells really well, and that we have to be honest about those of us who have climbed the socioeconomic ladder, the role that we have played in making that be the primary focus of our faith. And I think that we've got to have people like, I saw you shout your pastor out, Dr. Price, Dr. Leslie, Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan, folks like that and others who do this kind of work. Those are the folks we have to never forget who are laboring in the vineyard to do this very kind of thing.
So amazing. I don't want to interrupt any thoughts. I want you here. We're over our time, and part of the reason why some of you are here during this hour is because you have a panel to go to right after that. So I want to express my appreciation for you for coming. But any closing remarks before I have to let our esteemed panelists go?
I just want to thank you for bringing us all together. It was a pleasure to be with some folks I know and to meet some new people. And so just thank you, and thank you for everyone and the wonderful questions. It was an honor to be here.
You know, I have loved having this conversation. I think that it's almost impossible to do serious transformational work without having some level of spiritual practice, without having some way of centering yourself, without having some way of getting outside of your individual struggle and thinking about other things. Christianity is one of those ways, but there are many others. And so I think it is important for us as these kids move through these movements that they don't come through broken. And the way to help them do that is to offer them and to articulate to them ways that they can use the traditions of their foreparents to actually keep their minds safe as they move through what is a struggle. So I hope that they got that from this today.
I'd like to thank you, Dr. Tinsley, for inviting me, and the discussion was rich. I was feasting on what the other panelists said and what they shared and how they responded to the questions. I love this stuff. I live for this stuff, race, religion, and nation. I didn't know how it was gonna start. I didn't know which twists and turns, but I'm glad that I was part of the conversation. And I wanted to also give a special shout out to Dr. Price, because her scholarship was influential in my writing my book. You in a big end note. So thank you for your scholarship and congratulations on your new position in center. And yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for being wonderful conversation partners.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. You'll hear more from our center and what we'll be doing next. We'll add you to our mailing list, and take care and be well.